Hi, welcome back to another podcast. We're still into the book Joy of Living by J. Dwight Pentecost. It's a study on Philippians. In my last podcast, I mentioned that I was going to talk about saints ministering to saints. This is where it actually gets into where Paul says, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you for your fellowship in the gospel. And then this is in verses 3 and 5. And then in chapter 6, verse 2, where he talks about bear ye one another's burdens. So Paul is actually touching on something very vital here, that believers in the church and in the ministry are to actually bear each other's burdens and lift each other up. Paul's writing to the Philippians, or give you a reminder that at this point Paul is sitting in jail waiting to be extradited back to Rome to be persecuted for the preaching of the gospel. At this time, many of the believers that he had converted prior to going to jail, and even while he was in jail, you read about the conversion of the Roman guard, you read about the conversion of the other prisoners that were in that jail because of Paul's joy, because of Paul ministering to them. And these people actually start ministering to Paul. They start supplying every one of Paul's needs by bringing him his books so that he may continue to study, by bringing him material so that he can actually write his letters, because a lot of his letters to the churches were actually written while he was in Roman prison. And they started providing for his daily needs, for food, a warm coat, and you read this all through the Bible. So one of the things is, as we think about our role in the church as what we call today's saints, I'm not getting into what the Catholic Church calls as saints, deeming people to sainthoods. This was to the average congregation who was fulfilling the work of the church. This was to the aggregate believer. So this is what we're talking about by saints. Now, if you know anything about Bible translations, Tyndale, when he first wrote his translation, he did not have the word church in it. He had congregation, meeting the people. And the reason why he wrote that way was to separate the fact that it was actually talking about those believers, the congregation, and not the church officials or the establishment of the church building or a synagogue. So when we talk about saints in this writing in Philippians and through the Bibles, we really mean the people, the congregation, the followers of Jesus Christ. So us as believers, or saints as the word is used, we are to be ministering to those in our midst who are also part of the church. And I've seen that a lot, and especially the church that I'm going to now, where they're edifying, lifting up, and sometimes they may provide financial needs. But I also want to talk about what happens in a lot of churches today where this is not happening, and it's sad. In my Christian walk, I had been through several churches, and this has happened to other congregation members and also myself. So there have been people that had served in the church for a long time. They had given their whole heart to Christ. They had given their whole heart to the church, the functioning of the church, the ministry of the church, serving every day in the church. And something happened in their lives, and the church turned their back or turned a blind eye. I can remember there was one person in the church that I actually went to seminary at, and the pastor was a very good pastor, very compassionate, knew the Word of God and everything. And there was one guy who served in that church. He served so much in that church that the majority of his life was to that congregation, that building, that local church. He was saved in that church. He spent his entire layman's ministry. I don't think he was ever a deacon or an elder in that church, but he had served. This guy would go as far as, we had some flooding rains, and what had happened is when the church was built back in those days, the road that was on the side of the church did not exist. Back in those days when communities were tight communities and they built the church, they would say, yeah, go ahead and run like the drain lines or whatever through my property and then down to the river. So that's what had happened in the building of this church. When they put in the drain lines and the pumps so that the basement, or what became now the fellowship hall, would flood, the pump would actually pump out the drain lines, go across into the field, into the guy's property, and down to the river. Over the years, the property was sold, the town came in, put a road in, and so those lines eventually, over the years, became blocked and no longer functioning, so that when it rained, water would back up into the basement, or what is now the fellowship hall, and there was really nothing we could do about it because it was now illegal to put drain lines going down anywhere close to the river, and there was not enough property behind the church and the river to run them that way. We could not fix those drain lines because now there was a road there, and we'd have to get the city involved, and they said no. And then the property across the street was now owned by someone else who was not part of the church, so you can't go pretty much digging up somebody else's property. So when the basement or fellowship hall would flood, this guy was so dedicated to the church and local congregation that he would actually sleep at the church to make sure that the pump stayed running, the lines stayed as clear as they could, water was diverted to different areas, and then the big dryers that either the church owned or they brought in. I think a lot of times they were brought in because first disaster would be on hand, bringing in the dryers, to make sure that the floor and the carpeting was dry, and he would stay overnight. If we had any problems with the power or the heating system, he would stay overnight to make sure the pipes weren't freezing until they actually were able to get a technician in to fix that. He did a lot of work on the grounds of the church. He did a lot of painting of the church. And what happened was, later in life, his eyesight started failing him, and he eventually became blind. Now, the sad part about this, and what I want to talk about saints ministering to other saints, is at the time he became blind, I started noticing he was not coming to church anymore. And the pastor talked about how he was starting to become very bitter. What I found out was the deacons, the elders, and several congregation members had actually turned back on the individual. So they did not reach out to him in prayer. They didn't contact him. They didn't try to bring him to church. Nobody really went and visited him. So he started becoming very bitter. I don't think he ever lost his faith in Jesus Christ, but he started becoming very bitter to the church. So the saints of the church had totally failed him. That's the job of the church. As saints, we're supposed to be ministering to the saints so that they can keep going, that in their times of need, like Paul and the church at Philippi, actually ministering to Paul when he had the flesh wound in his side, when he needed a coat, when he needed his books, when he needed his writing material. That church brought that stuff to him. So, the church needs to be lifting up the saints who had actually dedicated their whole lives. I mean, that's part of the gospel, where the saints are to lift up other saints. And I also saw this, with other members of the church, where, the saints would no longer lift them up. Now, I could see if they were falling into sin. I could see if they needed to be brought back into the fellowship with Christ, why they may draw back. But the true gospel, besides reaching out to other individuals, is we're to minister to each other. Give an example of what happened in my life. I started attending a church. Probably spent about 4 years at this church before we moved. And my going into that church was after my seminary pastor had died, after I served at different churches and things were changing, and I felt like the church was kind of like not doing its job. There had been splits in the church, and it just started getting real awkward, and I felt the call to be going to another church because I don't take leaving churches lightly. It's got to be a strong reason for me to leave the church that I'm attending to go to another church, unless I'm actually have no choice and I'm moving. So I had changed churches. I had went from the Baptist denomination to non-denominational back into the Southern Baptist denomination. So at this point of joining this church, I was already licensed to the gospel ministry by the church I had attended seminary at. Now, you don't need to be licensed to go out and doing everything. Basically, all this license did was to confirm the fact to other people and saying that the church did agree with and sanctify me going out, sharing the gospel, baptizing, teaching, and preaching. It was not what they would call an ordination, where that takes into the legal aspects and the paperwork of the legal aspects of doing weddings and funerals. Basically, I did not need that certification to go out and do that, because in the Bible, we're told to go out and be called to do that. But it was something that the church had given to me. So I'd already been licensed into the ministry, which is also part of the Baptist denomination, that they would recognize me as a minister. And then this church, being part of that, was the one who saw the call in that. I had also been through various other trainings. So when I joined this church, I was not on the staff, but I actually attended, not so much the financial meetings, but all the teachings. In other words, when they had teachings on the deacon that I want to be and talked about the deacon ministry, I attended that, and they allowed me to attend that, and they welcomed that. I served in a couple areas of the children's ministry. I served in a few other areas. I've actually preached from their pulpit as a fill-in on Wednesday night services. But what had happened was, about the time of 2009, 2010, our country was in a very, very deep recession, and I had lost my job. I was laid off from work, and because money was getting tight and this church was about a little over half an hour, almost 40 minutes away, we were way out in the country. We were like a one red light, one grocery store town. This church was pretty much out in one main road in the middle of the woods between two towns. It took about half an hour, 40 minutes to get there, and I became deeply involved. But during the recession, I had lost my job, and money became really tight, and the youth pastor and the worship leader were actually the same person, and I expressed to him that I had to start backing off a little bit because I just could not afford the gas money to be going there to service on Sundays, to be serving Wednesday night, attending these meetings, and doing the other stuff that the children's ministry, although a couple times I did go down on my own because the children's Christmas cantata was taking place, and I wanted to see the blessing through these children, because I felt called still at that time to children's ministries. So I had to start backing off. One of the sad things that happened is nobody in that church came to me and started, questioning why I was not serving as much anymore and why I was not attending as many meetings. It also was coming down to the fact that the youth pastor, worship leader, and the pastor of the church at that time were having some disagreements, and basically the pastor fired the youth minister, and it got totally awkward. I don't know all the reasoning. I'm not going to share all the reasoning, but truthfully, it was something that probably should have been worked out and really wasn't warranted as becoming that far. But ego kind of took over on the pastor's point, and he kept saying, well, you're not coming under the authorship of the pastor. So it got really awkward, and by that time my attendance had really dropped off because I had not had the money to pay for the gas to go back and forth, and nobody really ministered to me during that point. It came about the time that I was no longer on my property. I was moving to a different town. So I said to the pastor that I was leaving the church. I was moving and I was going to find another church. So he became very concerned. He wanted to have dinner with my wife and I. So we sat down to dinner, and it got a little bit awkward because it brought up the fact of the split that was going on between him and the youth pastor. And so he ultimately asked me, what came down to my final decision of leaving the church. And I said, it was a combination of things. I said, one, the split was getting awkward. He totally defended his side, had nothing to say about the youth and worship pastor. Told him because I was moving, it was going to be a further drive. And he said, well, you were already driving half an hour, 45 minutes. You probably could make the additional half an hour drive or whatever. Then I told him, I said, also, not only that, I'm moving because I have not been able to find a job. I found a job here. As you know, I'm getting rid of my property and we're moving here. And truthfully, I really don't feel a connection to this church anymore, because when I was going through these things, nobody checked on me why my attendance was starting to drop. Nobody checked on me to see how I was doing, the fact that I wasn't working and we were starting to struggle. And I brought up, what had happened in another church to another congregation member, that he had devoted his whole life to the church, and the church turned bad. And I said, I kind of felt like I gave a lot to this church, and then when I was going through a need, nobody really was there for me, and nobody offered up prayer, and nobody offered up any edifying words and everything. His exact words were, well, you weren't around, so we had no idea what was going on. Really? I had been, like I said, I had been to most every one of the meetings. I was serving faithfully in that church up until like the last 3 or 4 months before I had gotten another job. We were moving, and I would have to find another church to go to. He had said that I wasn't around and they had no idea what was going on. So that kind of led into a fact that when I'm getting into about saints ministering to other saints, it is our job as a church to recognize when church members are falling away and contact them. When we see that, so-and-so wasn't in church today, so-and-so has stopped coming, or maybe their physical health or whatever reason stops them from serving, we're to reach out and minister to them. Like these saints at Philippi were ministering to Paul. It becomes a two-way street. So this is something that Paul had to learn, because he was not accustomed to that them giving to him, and then because all that he gave to them. So it speaks very much about this, that part of the joy of living is saints giving to other saints. And when you don't do that, it's a detriment to both of you. It's a detriment to the one not being ministered to. It becomes that a lot of the reasons, especially today, that's a reason for someone to leave the church and become no longer a believer in Christ if their faith was not strong to begin with, and actually also turn their back because they started out giving so much, and then nobody ministers to them in their time of need. Nobody ministers to them to teach them how to go out further. So they feel they're all alone in this. They're doing things by themselves. Nobody's helping them. They're alone. So they start suffering depression. They start suffering. So it's a detriment to those who have served and not being ministered to by the other saints. The other part about this is when you as a church or an individual are not ministering to that person in need, it's a detriment to yourself as well. And I'm pointing that finger back at me as well. So it's a detriment when you do not reach out to these people and minister to them, because part of kingdom living, part of the gospel, part of what Paul is writing in his letters is that the joy comes from serving. The joy comes from helping each other. Christ will bless us as we bless each other. Christ will lift us up and soften our hearts and give us more of a heart of servanthood, give us more of a heart of giving, give us more resources to give with as we're giving to those needs. And us as saints or the congregation or those who follow Christ, we're the ones who are equipped and have the Word of God through His Bible, the teaching of sound authors to actually expand what this means in a sound biblical way, to actually give us the tools and the knowledge to equip those people. And that just keeps manifesting. It's like a snowball effect where more we minister to others, the more we're supposed to be ministered to, the more we're supposed to minister to others. Christ gives us joy through that, the joy through serving, the joy of seeing people lift up, the joy of seeing people turn their lives around, the joy of having your needs met, the joy of meeting other people's needs. It's just a big snowball. And that's what Paul is writing to them, and why he actually remembers them by name. He remembers the name of every single person that ministered to him, as he also ministered to them in the beginning. So today, I feel the church is really failing at this fact. A lot of churches today, we don't hear about the shut-in or nursing home ministry anymore, where members of our congregants go into hospice care or the nursing homes. A lot of times, if it wasn't for their family, they would be by themselves. When was the last time that you actually visited one of these people? And I'm going to bring up something else that happened in one of my local churches, and also to me. So in my early days, under the authority and the guidance of my seminary pastor, we had started a shepherding ministry, which would be kind of like saints ministering to saints, what we're talking about today. And it would also be ministering to those outside the congregation. This was really supposed to be the role of what biblical deacons are, not elders, because elders are supposed to be concerned with the affairs of the church, the finances, the building, the administration, all that. Deacons come right under the pastor when it comes to the shepherding, the care, the teaching of the word. So we did not have elders. We had deacons, and these deacons were acting more like elders. They weren't doing the shepherding, the teaching. A lot of them were more pointing fingers at different people. You know, don't do this, you're doing this, why are you involved? But anyway, besides the point. So the pastor saw that we needed the shepherding ministry. And he came to me because of my intercessory heart, my teaching that I was getting. So it had come for me to lead the shepherding ministry, where we would minister to other people in the congregation and all that. And he wanted me to build a team. So I started seeking out different members, and I got the old, well, yeah, whatever you need from me, I guess, maybe, whatever you need, but their heart wasn't in it. And ultimately, they didn't serve. And again, I'm not bragging or anything. This is just to tell you what happened, and on the fact that saints need to minister to other saints. It came down that I was doing everything in the ministry. I was going to the hospitals. I was calling people on the phone. I was going to homes. I was meeting people, various places. I was talking to the church. And after about a month or two, the pastor came to me and he said, I'm sorry, but we have to end this ministry. we have to shut down the shepherding ministry. And the only reason why we're doing this is because the other people are not stepping up. You're the only one who's doing it. And because you work a full-time job, you're serving in other areas of this church, plus you're doing this ministry, you are running around, especially for this ministry, hundreds of miles a week, spending your gas money and all that, and you're just going to ultimately burn yourself out. So at that point, the saints were really letting down the other saints. And they were not serving the other saints. They were not ministering to the other saints. They were not lifting each other up. So this is what Paul is also talking about in the joy in Philippians and the joy of living. In this book, there's a story about a guy who was in the hospital, but I'm going to back up to... So Paul was thanking them for the fellowship and bear each other's burdens, and it says, believers are joined together into one body, and its function of the one body need to minister to another member of the body. If the member of the body does not minister to another member, it becomes detriment to both. So what happened is, at this point, pride often enters into the experience instead of Christ. When a need comes into our lives, the natural response is to bear it alone. And, I went through this a time in my life at all where I did not want to bother anybody in my needs. So we consider it a sign of weakness, either human or even in our spiritual weakness, to share that need with another saint so that he might be a channel of God's comfort and help and encouragement. Because we try to bear without the help of the members of the body, we miss God's comfort. We miss God's strength. We miss God's joy. We do not for a moment suggest that Christ is inefficient, but Christ's help often comes from the saints at time of need. Do you think Roman imprisonment and all that was entailed was an easy experience for Paul? Do you think that Paul enjoyed being stoned, beaten, and even when he was shipwrecked? But in all, Paul was joyful. Why? Because the saints ministered to him, and Christ's comfort was channeled through the saints. So God is calling on us to minister and to channel his comfort to those in need, especially other members and congregations of our church. And God takes many of his children through experiences where they find Christ's comfort and help through the saints for a time of need. And it goes on to talk about how this guy's brother, who's writing this book, had underwent a major surgery, and as soon as he got out of the hospital, his wife fell and broke her leg, so they were kind of like both down. And God ministered through the saints. This was the Apostle Paul's confidence concerning them, and explained why in verse 6, he has which begun a good work, and you will perform it until the day of Christ. If we really want to be followers of God, if we really want to be ministers, if we really want to see the church grow, we also got to be ministering to those in the church and in the body itself. And a lot of times when you see church congregations start to dwindle and it starts to become basically a maintenance church just for those who are continuing to go there, but the church is not growing, people are leaving the church. A lot of the time it's because the church has actually forgotten those that are already in its midst. There are some churches that become so engrossed in outreach. Now, outreach is good. We are, that's the whole thing about, Jesus Christ was his outreach and the community and the nations, all that. But who did he minister to first? He ministered first to the disciples, to his followers. And we as saints, we as the congregation, we as the leaders of our church are to build each other up and minister to each other so that we can keep this whole thing going. This whole thing of equipping each other, of helping each other when it's down so that we can get back on our feet to what God has called us. So that's what this whole podcast and teaching and the reading of this book is about, that we as an individual and as a church need to be looking out for those inside our church who may have fallen, may have started struggling with sin, may have fallen to sickness, may have fallen hard times. How can we lift them up to keep their faith and rebuild their faith and help them to continue to minister to others in the midst of their infirmities and being down? So just something to think about and meditate on today, that we need to be lifting each other up. So often I see so many people turning their backs or even sharing a wrong word or sharing something that may have absolutely nothing to do with what they're talking about. It's like, basically, you're explaining your call to someone, or, you're explaining something and they're like, well, you need to level up. You need to do this. You need to do that because of this. And they start going down this road of doesn't even make sense to what you're talking about. Or worse, they just totally don't even reach out, don't even well, you're kind of alone in this. Once you get that figured out, we're not supposed to figure it out on our own. We're supposed to have the saints ministering to us, the congregation ministering to us, the church ministering to us as we minister to each other, to lift each other up and bring each other back. This is why so many people nowadays are coming out with podcasts and everything, why I left the church, why I left Christianity. And I've walked into churches that just felt so cold. They didn't greet you as you walked in or made you feel welcome. They didn't follow up with you. We have a thing in our church called Getting Connected, where we share the vision of the church. It happens once a month, where we invite the new members to come in and we share our gifts and how we're supposed to lift each other up and discover our gifts. But there's been a lot of people who've been outspoken against Christianity these days because we are failing to, never mind failing our community, we're failing to lift each other up. It's something that really burns my heart and makes me sad when this happens, that you see a good, faithful member, especially somebody who's been in the ministry, just say, you know what, I'm done. I can't do this anymore because I'm doing it all alone. I can't go on anymore. I have no support. Nobody cares. Nobody's helping me. And they start going into anxiety, depression. And it just makes me sad. And even in the last podcast that I shared, where even if you don't have the backing of being sent out and doing all this, God will bring people in your life. And that's what the Philippians did as they began to minister to Paul, because he was ministering to them. So, when that stops happening, that we stop ministering to each other, is just totally putting a defeat on the kingdom of the gospel and the true calling of the church and the true calling of salvation to Jesus Christ. Oh, God made it clear in his book that the Christians and the Jews, the called out Jews, and the church and the Christ followers will be victorious. But in the process, through the lies of Satan, through the people turning their backs and everything, we're losing many people from the faith. And that just saddens my heart. We are to, and that's part of the joy of living, is serving each other. So I'm going to bring this to a close, and I'm just going to say my prayer for you is to really think about how you can lift up someone, especially in your church today. seek out those who are going through stuff, whether it be just sharing a prayer, sharing a word, or even if you have some resources to help bring them back into the fold, help minister them up, lift them up, and even to help them in their calling. That as a church, we need to get back to that sense of community. Our culture and our world has been so much about me, me, me. I'm not a true fan of Joyce Myers, but in one of her things, she has this act that she does about the robot. What about me? 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 And in our society, we have become such a me, me, I, my society. No. Like in Philippi and what Paul is writing about in the Philippians, it is about we. Saints ministering to saints. We seeking out, and then they in turn minister to us. I'm just going to leave you with that, and I hope you have a blessed week. Hope you have a blessed day. I hope you have a true joy in your life. Seek out joy. I really suggest reading through the book of Philippians in the Bible, because the whole theme about the book of Philippians is, and I'm probably going to be sharing more, is about thankfulness and prayer, to live in Christ, to see Christ preach, striving and suffering for Christ, unity through humility, the humbled and exalted Christ. It's all about the joy of serving and the joy of being served. So have a blessed week, and we'll see you in the next one.